Alrighty. Hello. We can go to the next slide. So here we have our team members who will be presenting today. Shavonda Joyner, who you just met, will be our facilitator. Jane Pennington is our technical host. Martha Hankins, the policy and planning section manager, will present. Cooper Garby, the rules and planning unit supervisor, will present. My name is Anthony. I'm the environmental planner leading this rulemaking, and I'll also be presenting. It's nice to meet everybody. Next slide. First, we will give a quick overview of the Improving Air Quality in Overburdened Communities initiative before discussing rulemaking in general and its different processes. Then we'll talk about how those processes apply to this rulemaking and outline what we've done, where we are, and next steps. We'll introduce some possible rulemaking topics before holding a questions and answers session towards the end of the presentation. As a reminder, please hold your questions until then. And finally, we'll conclude with some additional information, resources, and next steps. I'll now hand it over to Martha, who will provide an overview of the initiative. Next slide.
Good morning, welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us here. I'm Martha Hankins, and I'm with the Department of Ecology in our air quality program. I manage the policy and planning section in the air program. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this first in a series of virtual webinars, virtual workshops. And your participation is really important. I know we have people from a wide variety of interests and experiences, and this is great. We've tried to tailor these presentations with this in mind. And this is the kickoff event for the rulemaking effort we recently announced for improving air quality through emission reductions in identified overburdened communities that are highly impacted by air pollution. And so I'll say a few things generally about where we're headed with this work. And then we'll talk about how the agency goes about rulemaking in general. And then we'll talk about what's ahead specifically for this rulemaking effort. Next slide, please. In 2021, our state passed the landmark Climate Commitment Act, and this law established a cap and invest program to reduce greenhouse gases in Washington. And an important component of the law was recognition that certain areas, certain communities across the state are disproportionately impacted by climate change and by air pollution, and that people in these areas experience health and environmental inequities. And the Department of Ecology is directed by the Environmental Justice Review portion of the Climate Commitment Act to address criteria air pollution in overburdened communities that are highly impacted by air pollution. And criteria pollutants, that's the term that's used to refer to the 6 most common air pollutants. These are the ones where federal law has required EPA to establish national ambient air quality standards. It's particulate matter, tiny particles, soot, sometimes called PM, as well as ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead. And in 2023, the Department of Ecology identified communities that have historically experienced health, socioeconomic, and environmental inequities, and that are highly impacted by these criteria pollutants. We've been working to improve air quality in these communities. This rulemaking is only part of a broader initiative, and the initiative includes a greater focus on community engagement, as well as expanding where and how we monitor air pollution. We've launched a new grant program, and now with this rulemaking effort, we're looking at regulatory options as directed by the law. I'll note that the law also directs ecology to review and report on progress on greenhouse gases, criteria pollutants, and health impacts every 2 years. And so the next review will be coming in 2025. Next slide, please. So the 2023 report, I think I saw Anthony post a link, or somebody post a link in the chat. The 2023 report identifies the communities across Washington. These areas were identified specifically for the purposes of the environmental justice component of the Climate Commitment Act. The areas identified, they vary in size. They're spread across the state. It's a mix of urban, suburban, rural areas. Tribal consultation is currently underway, and we expect that there's a possibility that tribes will be added as well. I'm not going to talk about the report, except to say that it provides a baseline for criteria pollutants in the identified communities. There are citations and links later in the presentation. I just want to mention that's available, and I invite you to take a look. There's also a really nice story map that it accompanies the report. Next slide, please. So dialing in a bit more specifically, the Environmental Justice Review section in the Climate Commitment Act is what directs ecology to identify and monitor and reduce air pollution in these identified overburdened communities. And in terms of regulatory options for reducing air pollution, I want to say up front that we have not determined any particulars about what should or should not be included in rule. And our work over the next many months is going to be to unpack this. And this slide shows, just very generally, one way of looking at what's in front of us. And the law goes from considering sources and greatest contributors. It talks about high priority significant emitters. We'll need to figure out that piece. We'll want to work through how to reach the needed reductions. What is it going to take to get to air quality targets? And this will involve looking at options around emission control strategies and adopting stricter standards and emission limits. And we do want to involve all of you in these discussions. Those who have been watching know that there's also language in the law about proportional contributions. So we know that how that component is implemented will be of interest. These are all headed towards achieving reductions in emissions. And it's shown here as orders, but there may be other strategies and options to discuss as well. There's a lot here. Again, we have not identified what of all of this needs to be included in rule. I do think that all of these components are going to be part of the conversation. Next slide, please. So I'll touch briefly on the upcoming workshops, though there's more of this later in the presentation. We're very much in the process of mapping out the road ahead. I guess I want to say a few words about what's not part of this rulemaking. The identifying the overburdened communities, the 16 that have been identified, that report is available and is not, the identifying the communities is not part of this rulemaking effort. Also not part of this effort is the questions in the work around monitoring and reporting progress. But the other pieces, potential workshop topics, we'll want to discuss what sources to consider, how to establish the greatest contributors, how to apply stricter standards or other options for reducing emissions, and how to achieve the targets. What we want to talk about first, second, third, that's still in flux. We break out topics for planning purposes, but they really do all fit together. For example, it seems that if we want to talk about stricter standards, it's logical we're also going to want to talk about who they would apply to. I do think that as a minimum, we'll be having discussions about the processes and strategies for determining each of these components. It feels like a lot. However, I'll also note that this is not an exhaustive list and your feedback is welcome. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So that's sort of a broad overview of where we're going with the rulemaking effort. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that air pollution comes from many types of sources. Some are controllable, some, like wildfire, are not controllable. And then this is going to be important to keep in mind as we look at emission reductions and the strategies that we need to reach air quality targets. So we'll need to consider as we move through the rulemaking, we'll be considering where specifically is the pollution coming from, what sources are impacting each community and by how much, and what do we do? How do we make progress towards air quality targets? Next slide, please. So wrapping up my whirlwind fast overview here. Our goals, we want to share information. We want to hear what you think about the various options. We want to listen. We invite input. And as we move forward, please know that any timelines we float right now are approximate. We may adjust where possible as we go along. We do not as yet have this figured out. We will be developing processes and strategies for reducing emissions. That's in front of us. We do intend to have a transparent process. Public input, your input is important. It's a key part of how we're going to move through this rulemaking. And with that, I again want to thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Cooper Garby, who's going to review generally some principles about how rulemaking works.
Yeah, thank you, Martha. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cooper Garby. I am the Rules and Planning Unit Supervisor here in our air quality program. It's nice to have you all this morning. Next slide, please. As Martha mentioned, she gave a brief overview of the topic at hand, air quality in overburdened communities. I'd like to give just a very short overview of what the general rulemaking process looks like and where we look to be going through this. And then I'll hand it over to Anthony to tie it together with our specific rulemaking. Next slide, please. So you may have seen already in one of the slides the term RCW, Revised Code of Washington. Just real quick, for those of you may not be as familiar with rulemaking, the Revised Code of Washington is the legislation that we base our rule on. And so for this particular one that we're talking about, the legislation was the Climate Commitment Act passed in 2021. It's now codified as RCW 70A.65. We're specifically looking at Section 020, the Environmental Justice Review. And oftentimes legislation will lay out a general idea of what should be considered for a rule, what might need to be included in a rule, but it doesn't always get into the gritty details of how that rule might play out. And that's where we go into the rulemaking process. And so, based on that legislation, we develop a new chapter for this one particularly in the Washington Administrative Code, which would be WAC 173-448 is our what we're looking to develop as a new chapter, and that would be specifically for the implementation of that legislation I just mentioned. How we do that is through the rulemaking process, and that's what we're here kind of kicking off today is that process. It involves a lot of feedback from the public, some of which is detailed in the Administrative Procedures Act, which tells us how we should notify the public. It tells us when to hold hearings, and it tells us a little bit more about how do we respond to formal comments. That's something we'll get to a little bit later down the road, but for the time being, we also want to have a little bit more of an informal dialogue, and that's a really important part of the rulemaking. Next slide, please. So this is our rulemaking process broken down into three distinct phases, if you will. The first one being we think about so we look at the legislation, we think about what might need to go into a rule, and we kind of contemplate that. And then we announce to the public that we're intending to do a rulemaking and we're opening up a rulemaking. We've gotten to that part already. That happened in October. And so this next piece here, as you can kind of see in the middle of this diagram, is where we're at now, is preparing prior to getting to any sort of rule proposal and really getting that feedback and that dialogue started. This is just in my opinion, this is one of the most important parts of rulemaking because this is where we really get a good opportunity to work collaboratively with stakeholders, with the public, with anybody interested in this. And when I talk about our process, I really hope that we make this an our process where everybody on this meeting and continuing to participate really takes a little bit of ownership of this process. And we want to hear your feedback. We want to see your comments. We want to know if there's something that you want more information about. That happens during this piece where we start to put together these webinars, these workshops, where we can gather that dialogue and comments. And so that's where we're at now. And that's where we'll spend the bulk of the rulemaking actually is through that piece where we'll accept informal comments and we'll start to draft some potential rule language. And we'll do that through the process of dialogue with the public and with stakeholders. And what we would like to do is, bring back some ideas after hearing comments and bring back some potential draft rule language and let people look it over and tell us what they like, what they don't like, and then do that a few times. It should be, an iterative process. Then further down the road, like I said, this piece that we're in right now should take the longest. It typically does, and that's because we really want to get that feedback. But further down the road, once we get to a good point, we'll take that rule language and when we feel good about it, we'll really look it over. We'll finalize looking at some of the informal comments, and we'll put together a full proposal. And then once we get that proposal together, we'll give an analysis of what that proposal might impact, how it might be implemented. And then we'll actually make that rule proposal, and that starts a little bit more of a formal process where we open up for formal comments, but we don't have that same amount of dialogue. And so that's why I say this part here is very important. Once we open up that formal comment process, we will hold at least one public hearing, possibly more, depending on where we're at. And that's something that will probably be in a little bit, maybe about a year. It's a fluid situation where it could change depending on how this back and forth goes. So that one's a little bit further off. And then once we propose, excuse me, and we get formal comments, we close the comment period, we'll go back and we'll look at the formal comments and we will develop a response to comments. And before adopting a rule, we'll make sure that we have that document ready. And then we will hopefully, if we feel like we've got a good rule, we will put that before the director and hope for signature to adopt a final rule. And if that is the case, and we do indeed adopt a final rule, at that point, we publish a response to those formal comments. Next slide, please. So with that brief overview of the general rulemaking process, I'd like to hand it over to Anthony Bruma to take us through this specific rulemaking. Anthony.
Thanks, Cooper. I think this is a good point in the presentation to also remind folks that you can rename yourselves by going into the um, three dots next to your name and then pressing on rename. It's a nice way to just let us know like your affiliation, your name, because some folks have also dialed in with telephones. Like there's a 509, there's a couple 509 numbers. We can help rename you if you'd like. Maybe come off mute. I don't know who 509625 is. Would you mind letting us know who you are? How about 50900907? Okay.
I'm not too sure, Anthony, if anyone can do that, but I will suggest during the Q&A, if you do have a question and we cannot see your name and or affiliation, please introduce yourself and give us your affiliation. And if you wouldn't mind, if we can't see your name, to spell it out for us. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Chevy. Okay, so let's go ahead then and move into this next section. Now that we've got some familiarity with the rulemaking process, let's look at this rulemaking in specific. It's important to note that for this rulemaking, we're creating a new chapter in the Washington Administrative Code. It'll be Chapter 173-448. A lot of the climate work at Ecology, like the Cap and Invest program, involves reducing greenhouse gases at the state level. However, measures for reducing overall state levels of greenhouse gases might not decrease another category of pollutants called criteria air pollutants at community levels. So as a result, air quality and environmental justice provisions in the Climate Commitment Act with the Healthy Environment for All Act direct Ecology's air quality program to reduce air pollution in overburdened communities highly impacted by air pollution. Next slide. The first phase of our Improving Air Quality in Overburdened Communities initiative, which has been completed, had to do with identifying the overburdened communities highly impacted by air pollution in Washington State. This was done with tools like the DOH's Health Disparities Map, EPA's EJ Screen, as well as a modeling and monitoring tool, which helped satisfy subsection 1A of the statute. Levels of pollution in each community were then published in the first Environmental Justice Review, which satisfies the first part of subsection 2A. Though we won't be focusing on these two topics today, if you do have additional questions about them, please reach out to the contact on the linked material, or you can connect with me and I can try to get in touch with a subject matter expert. We are now turning to improving air quality in these overburdened communities. Next slide. So with the overburdened communities identified, we then moved into the announcement phase of rulemaking. After gathering some initial information and exploring our options, we announced the rulemaking on October 10th, 2024. During this period, we considered which parts of the statute could possibly inform or be a part of rulemaking. This diagram shares a closer look at the statutory language. You might ask yourself, why isn't it in order? For example, subsection 1C follows parts of subsection 2. And that's a good question. As we look at the statute, we're constantly considering what we're aiming for. This is just one way of bringing up topics for discussion. We might learn better ways of visualizing the process as we go along. And as Martha's mentioned, we are not sure what's going in the rule. The next few slides highlight some topics that we're thinking about including in the conversations as we figure out what's going in the rule throughout 2025. It's important to note that we want to work through some questions together, and we'll be coming back with information to help you give feedback in subsequent meetings. Next slide. So this is showing subsection 2B1 of the statute. It requires ecology to establish air quality targets in overburdened communities. Most air quality in Washington state is well below the federally established national ambient air quality standards. So the program's considering how to compare air quality in overburdened communities to air quality in neighboring communities. Not all criteria pollutants are of great concern in each community. Some communities experience very low levels of pollution from certain air pollutants. However, PM 2.5 is a concern in each community. Our scientists are using data from the monitoring network and modeling tools to answer these questions. They're also exploring different technical processes for defining the neighboring community for each overburdened community. The air quality program is exploring and scoping the following questions. How should air quality targets be determined for each criteria air pollutant in each overburdened community? How do you compare air quality between two locations? And what does it mean to be a neighboring community? Next slide. Subsection 1C of the statute directs ecology to identify the greatest contributors of criteria air pollutants and develop a high priority list of significant emitters. The program's exploring and scoping the following questions. Which criteria air pollutants are of greatest concern in each community? How can we identify and define the greatest contributors as well as high priority significant emitters? Which categories of regulated sources should be considered? The air quality program will use data from the emissions inventory and modeling tools to answer these questions. Our scientists are considering different options for how to answer these questions, weighing the benefits and limitations of each. Next slide. Subsection 2B4 of the statute requires ecology to adopt with local air pollution control authorities stricter air quality standards, emission standards, or emission limitations on criteria pollutants. We'll be moving toward having a menu of options related to emissions reductions for discussion at an upcoming meeting around the summer of 2025. By that point, we want to come to you with some material for your feedback. The air quality program is exploring and scoping the following questions. Who needs to reduce their emissions? When do emissions need to be reduced? And by how much do emissions need to be reduced? As a reminder, while we consider these topics and questions, we hope to have public dialogue about them in upcoming meetings. Next slide. And here we have a tentative rulemaking timeline. After announcing rulemaking, we started discussing the potential rulemaking topics that we just reviewed and began planning for future public meetings. This timeline focuses on the proposal phase of rulemaking and includes some of the tentative upcoming workshops. It's important to note that dates are still tentative, We're committed to holding future meetings, but the topics and timing could change as we may need to adjust. Also, our proposal date is tentative. I want to bring attention to the frequency of workshops. So every other month, we hope to address new topics. And for each virtual public meeting, we intend on having both a morning and evening webinar to address the same content. Our reasoning is that we want to accommodate different schedules. Agenda and meeting materials will be shared. Outreach and engagement will take place. Language access will be considered. In between months, we will be preparing for the next public meeting that will include things like internal coordination, sending notices and communications to market the upcoming meeting. We may also summarize and share learning outcomes from prior meetings. Additional engagement activities might also occur between the public meeting schedule. During the same time, we'll be doing an environmental justice assessment, which is a process that helps ecology make informed decisions on how to prevent environmental health inequities. And finally, we are inviting you to comment throughout this whole process. This comment period is about getting good input early in the process to help collaborate on rule development. It's iterative, and although we won't respond to these comments, subsequent webinars, we might be, summarizing the information in subsequent webinars. We expect that in January, we will be communicating with you about our plans to host a workshop in February of 2025, and that could do with emission sources. Next slide. And with that, we'll soon start the questions and answers session. Next slide. I'll now end the recording, and then we can start the questions and answers after that.